"I can't keep pretending everything is fine," murmured Zachary, his voice quivering as he stood at the witness stand. The crowded courtroom buzzed with expectation, the hush of spectators so complete that the gentle hum of the overhead lights seemed thunderous. Every eye was locked on to Zachary, a 14-year-old boy with dark, intelligent eyes that betrayed more terror than bravery. The judge, a stern woman with silver-streaked hair pulled into a neat bun, peered at him over her bifocals and gave a nod of encouragement. Zachary glanced briefly at the person seated at the defense table, his father, Marvin Reed. Marvin did not meet his son's gaze. He stared forward, his jaw clenched tight, refusing to show any hint of emotion. Or perhaps it was simply that he had none left to give. Zachary's fingers curled around the wooden edge of the stand, seeking some kind of anchor. For several intense seconds he couldn't speak. He could only recall everything that had led him here, things he wished had never happened, truths he wished he could still unknow. But he had to speak, or the burden would swallow him whole. Taking a shaky breath, he finally said, "My father isn't who he claims to be." A ripple of astonishment swept through the spectators. Gasps fluttered like startled birds, bouncing off the walls in hushed echoes. Marvin's face twitched, but he held himself rigid, refusing to look at his son. A bailiff took a step forward, uncertain whether Zachary might faint or flee. But the boy stood firm, trembling though he was, and continued, "He's lied to everyone about who he is, about what he's done. And I can't keep lying for him." The judge rapped her gavel for order. The sound jolted Zachary, making his heartbeat spike. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, an unsettling reminder that the world was still turning, even while Zachary's whole universe felt on the verge of collapse. He thought of all the nights he'd tried to forget the bruises, the threats, the betrayals, and the nights he'd dreamed of telling the truth, but had always been too afraid. Now, as he released the words he had clutched so tightly, he felt both terrified and oddly free. He wasn't sure what would happen next, only that there was no going back. It had started nearly a year earlier, in the unassuming town of Lakebourne. Anyone passing through might have called it idyllic. Neat houses with small gardens, a picturesque main street lined with family-owned shops, and townspeople who greeted you on the sidewalk. Zachary and Marvin lived in a spacious suburban house near the edge of town. To neighbors and acquaintances, Marvin was the perfect single father, a respected figure who donated to local charities, led community cleanups, and always wore a wide, welcoming smile. People thought it heroic, a man raising a teenage boy alone after the mysterious disappearance of Zachary's mother years before. They admired Marvin's apparent commitment, praising him for showing up to every neighborhood barbecue, shaking every hand, inquiring after everyone's health. For a while, Zachary believed the same story. He knew no different. He was younger and had no memory of a time without Marvin in the house. Sure, Marvin was strict and occasionally lost his temper over small, trivial mistakes, but Zachary assumed everyone's home was like that. He'd been sheltered, taught not to ask questions, reminded over and over that they had to look out for each other. Marvin told him that the world was dangerous, that people couldn't be trusted, and that if Zachary obeyed, all would be well. In Lakebourne, Marvin spearheaded philanthropic projects, fundraising for the library, volunteering at the homeless shelter downtown, and running donation drives every holiday season. His name appeared in the local paper so often that people jokingly said he might as well run for mayor. If they only knew the truth, Zachary often thought grimly, but no one did. Not yet. Zachary's earliest recollection of real fear came on an evening just after he'd turned 13. He'd spilled a carton of milk while hurrying around the kitchen island, trying to finish dinner so he could do his homework. He remembered Marvin's voice, quiet, calm, too calm, saying, "Clean it up, son. You don't want me to teach you what happens to kids who don't clean their messes." Zachary's hands had trembled as he rushed to grab paper towels. As he bent down to wipe the floor, Marvin reached out and pressed his hand on Zachary's shoulder, making him flinch. That was the first time Zachary realized how strong his father was compared to him, how easily he could be overpowered. The following day, Marvin seemed nice again, back to his usual charismatic persona, as if nothing had happened. but the memory of that cold, quiet rage never left Zachary. Over the months, he began to notice more inconsistencies in Marvin's behavior. There were nights he brought home large sums of cash, which he stashed in a locked drawer. There were phone calls that ended abruptly whenever Zachary walked into the room. There was also the glaring fact that for all Marvin's talk of being a single father abandoned by a wayward spouse, he refused to discuss Zachary's mother in any meaningful way. If Zachary dared to ask about her or what had actually happened, Marvin's face would cloud with anger. "Stop living in the past," he'd snap. "I'm all you've got, do you understand?" Yet the world only saw the good side of Marvin, and so Zachary remained quiet. He had nightmares of being dragged into the unknown, of losing everything if he dared speak up. He dreaded his father's explosive temper and the possibility that no one would believe him if he told the truth. He retreated deeper into solitude, seldom talking to classmates, fearful that if he made friends or confided in someone, Marvin would find out. All that changed the day Zachary auditioned for an after-school poetry club run by Miss Griffith, a gentle teacher who wore beaded bracelets and tie-dye scarves, always exuding an air of calm acceptance. Zachary had sneaked behind Marvin's back to attend because he craved a sense of belonging. He discovered a love for writing, a quiet refuge from the chaos at home. That first day, Miss Griffith read one of Zachary's short pieces and praised his imagery, the rawness of his emotions on the page. No one had ever complimented him like that. "You have a gift with words," she had said, eyes warm. "I'd love for you to join us. I think it might help you process whatever you're going through." He was startled by her perceptiveness. Process what exactly? Did she sense the swirl of fear and shame behind his silence? He returned home that afternoon on an emotional high, half terrified and half excited. For a moment he could pretend there was a future where he could write, express himself, do something that Marvin would never understand. But that same evening, Marvin found out by rifling through Zachary's backpack he'd discovered a flyer advertising the club. Zachary's father confronted him, livid that he'd gone to an extracurricular without permission. The yelling left Zachary cowering near the couch. Marvin's hand lashed out, striking him across the face. Zachary stumbled, tears in his eyes, as Marvin's voice turned dangerously calm again. "Next time you ask. We can't have you running around making me look like a fool." After that, Zachary was forbidden from joining the club, but he continued to write in secret. Whenever Marvin left the house for an evening or claimed he had a late meeting, Zachary would scribble poems or short stories, letting his imagination roam places far from Lakebourne. He found fleeting courage in Miss Griffith's words of encouragement, though he never told her the reason he'd abruptly stopped attending. He made excuses. She didn't push, but she observed him with worried eyes, as though suspecting more than he revealed. His illusions of normalcy crumbled one damp afternoon. Marvin was away at a charity meeting, and Zachary, rummaging through a corner of the attic for old notebooks, discovered a battered cardboard box. Curious, he opened it to find a bizarre collection: documents, photos, bank statements, letters with addresses he'd never heard of. One letter bore an unfamiliar name, referencing large sums of money. Another was a photograph of a woman cradling a newborn. The woman looked exhausted but wore a resolute smile. The baby's hospital bracelet read, "Baby boy, mother, Harriet Thompson." Zachary's heart hammered in his chest. Harriet Thompson was not the name of the mother Marvin had always vaguely referred to. Marvin never mentioned that name, and nowhere on these documents did it read Zachary Reed. Instead, he found references to a Zachary Thompson, accompanied by an adoption form that looked suspiciously incomplete. The signature line for the adoptive father read Marvin Reed, but something about it felt off, like it had been forged or hastily written. Zachary felt the ground tilt beneath him. He sank onto the attic floor, the dust swirling around him in thick motes as the overhead bulb flickered. A question sharpened in his mind. If Marvin was truly his father, why would there be an adoption form? And if Marvin wasn't really his father, who was he? As dread spread through him, he kept flipping through the contents of the box. He uncovered more documents referencing property investments in other states, large charity donations that seemed to vanish, and a few receipts for payments from anonymous sources. It all felt like a secret puzzle pointing to some bigger scheme. He felt winded, as if he'd run a race. He wanted to believe it was a mistake, that Marvin might have rescued him from some bleak situation, but he kept remembering Marvin's controlling nature, his frequent rages, his hidden money. It was like someone had switched on a glaring light in a dark room, revealing cracks in the walls that had always been there. That night, Zachary barely slept. He kept hearing Marvin's voice in his head, repeating mantras about loyalty, about how the world was out to get them. Zachary wondered if that was ever about protecting him at all or just controlling him. By morning, he felt wrung out and full of questions. But he couldn't muster the courage to confront Marvin directly. What if it was all a misunderstanding? Or more terrifyingly, what if it wasn't? A few days later, Zachary was summoned to the principal's office. With trembling dread, he worried that Marvin had found out about the attic or that Miss Griffith had told someone about Zachary's situation. Instead, Miss Griffith was there, looking gravely concerned. She spoke gently, asking if everything was all right at home. Zachary, face burning, mumbled something about tension, about Marvin being stressed. Miss Griffith hesitated as if to press harder, but in the end she let it go. "I'm here if you ever need anything," she said softly, as though suspecting that behind his quiet presence lay a storm. Then came the day the police appeared at the Reeds' front door. Zachary had been in his room reading. He heard raised voices, footsteps on the porch, hushed but intense words. By the time he peeked through the window, he saw two officers stepping away, pointing at Marvin. For a moment, Zachary was sure Marvin was about to be arrested. Instead, the officers left with stern looks, giving Marvin what appeared to be an official document. Marvin slammed the door shut and stood in the foyer, fists clenched, breathing heavily. Zachary hovered at the top of the stairs, uncertain whether to remain hidden or step forward. He chose to vanish back into his room, heart pounding, mind reeling. Why were the police there? Had they discovered something about the money? Or was it about something else entirely? That night, Marvin's mood was unsettlingly calm, almost too pleasant. He ordered pizza, asked Zachary about his schoolwork, acted as though everything was normal. Zachary played along, but inside anxiety gnawed at him. He feared the calm might be a prelude to a hurricane. 2 days after that, a notice arrived in the mail. It seemed to be a subpoena summoning Marvin to court. Zachary caught a glimpse of it on the table. The words embezzlement and charitable fraud in bold type made his stomach twist. He realized that maybe the rumors swirling in his mind about shady money dealings were real. Marvin was being investigated for financial crimes. The day the trial began, Lakebourne buzzed like a hive of unsettled bees. Everyone was gossiping, speculating about how the beloved Marvin Reed could be in trouble. Some said it was just a misunderstanding. Others whispered that he'd probably stolen from charities and that all his philanthropic work was a smokescreen for laundering money. When Zachary accompanied Marvin to the courthouse, he felt as though he were drifting through a nightmare. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and Marvin maintained a blank, inscrutable expression. Zachary stayed near the back, feeling small, overshadowed by the swirl of legal drama. For the first few hearings, Zachary listened numbly as the prosecution laid out evidence of suspicious transactions. But Marvin's lawyer argued it was a clerical error, a framing, a jealous competitor's scheme. Witnesses took the stand, some praising Marvin for his generosity, others hinting there had always been something off about him. Zachary sat silent, arms wrapped around himself, head spinning. He told no one about the attic box. Part of him still clung to the hope that it was all a misunderstanding, that Marvin was flawed but not a monster. Then came the day when a detective claimed to have discovered multiple accounts linking Marvin to missing charity funds. Zachary saw the color drain from Marvin's cheeks as the courtroom murmured. As if the financial revelations weren't enough, the judge made a startling announcement. Someone else had come forward with allegations about Marvin. Allegations that might affect Zachary's guardianship. The moment the judge said the word guardianship, it was like a punch to Zachary's gut. Could it be about those documents in the attic? The judge demanded clarity on whether Marvin was, in fact, Zachary's legal parent or adoptive parent. Marvin's eyes darted nervously, flicking over to the silent boy in the rear of the courtroom. That was when Zachary realized there was no going back. The truth was unraveling, whether he spoke or not. He spent several sleepless nights wrestling with himself. If he testified in court, he'd be betraying the only father he had ever known. But if he stayed silent, he'd be betraying the truth and himself. Every memory of Marvin's looming shadow, every bruise disguised under long sleeves, every time Marvin's soft, threatening voice promised punishment for disobedience, haunted him. There was a sense that if he didn't speak now, he might never break free. The final tipping point came when he discovered a battered folder stuffed in the attic that he hadn't noticed before. Inside was a letter with Harriet Thompson's name at the top, dated from the day Zachary was born, describing how Harriet had no one to support her. It ended with a single line, "Please keep my child safe. I have no choice but to place him up for adoption." And it was signed with a trembling, looping signature that made tears burn in Zachary's eyes. The next morning, Zachary marched into the local police station, trembling so badly he could barely think. He placed the folder on the officer's desk and stammered out that it was important. He didn't mention the abuse or the controlling environment in so many words. He just said that something was wrong, that he believed these papers would prove Marvin wasn't who everyone thought. He'd expected the officers to dismiss him. Instead, one of them listened gravely, took the documents and said, "We'll look into it. Are you safe at home?" Zachary couldn't answer. He backed away, tears threatening to overwhelm him. The next few days were a blur of calls, of quietly telling Ms. Griffith bits of the story when she came to check on him, of hearing from a social worker named Mrs. Perry who was assigned to his case. Then came the day they arrested Marvin in the middle of the courthouse corridor. Cameras flared, bystanders gasped, and Zachary found himself whisked off to a temporary guardian's home while the investigation continued. Everything moved so fast he barely had time to breathe. Now, in the silent hush of the courtroom, with the judge and lawyers turned toward him, Zachary realized he was doing the very thing that had filled him with paralyzing dread for so long. He was testifying against Marvin, the man who had claimed to be his father and caretaker. He glanced at Marvin, who finally lifted his gaze to meet Zachary's eyes. Marvin's expression was unreadable, a swirl of anger and something else, maybe betrayal. The judge's calm voice pressed him. "Zachary, you said your father isn't who he claims to be. Please elaborate." Zachary swallowed, feeling tears well up. "I found documents, adoption papers, bank statements. He never told me I was adopted. He told me my mother left, that it was just us. But I think he's been lying about everything, who I am, who he is, and what he's done." Marvin's lawyer stood up, objecting vigorously, calling Zachary confused, manipulated. A hush fell. Then the prosecutor produced the folder Zachary had handed to the police, entered into evidence. "These documents," the prosecutor said, "tell a very different story of how Zachary came to live with Mr. Reed." Marvin sprang to his feet. "This is absurd. My son is being used. He's not old enough to understand these files. Someone's feeding him lines." The judge slammed the gavel for order. "Mr. Reed, sit down or I'll hold you in contempt." The tension was thick, every person on the edge of their seat. Zachary's heart pounded so loudly he could hardly hear. He remembered Miss Griffith's words, "Sometimes truth is the only way to heal." So, mustering all his courage, he took a shuddering breath and said, "He told me I was born to him and my mother, but that she ran off. He never told me I was adopted, and I never met Harriet Thompson. He was always furious if I tried to ask questions." The judge turned a critical eye on Marvin. "Mr. Reed, do you deny forging certain adoption documents and presenting yourself as Zachary's biological father?" Marvin's face was ashen. "I did what I had to do. Zachary needed a stable home, And Harriet, she wasn't fit to raise him. I saved him from a terrible situation. The prosecutor's mouth tightened. We have reason to believe Harriet Thompson tried to keep in touch, but those letters never reached Zachary. And there's more. We believe you used Zachary's name in certain financial dealings. The question is, why? Marvin glared at Zachary as though the boy had betrayed him. Zachary dropped his eyes, trying not to tremble. This was bigger than he imagined. Somehow, his name might have been used in Marvin's fraud. The room erupted in murmurs again, the judge calling for silence. Zachary could practically feel the swirl of speculation, suspicion, and shock around him. People get what they deserve eventually, he recalled Miss Griffith saying once, quoting from some old proverb. He hoped that was true. He felt guilt, heartbreak, and an odd sense of relief that the secrets were finally surfacing. The judge called a recess. Zachary sank onto a bench in the hallway, hugging himself. The swirl of attorneys, reporters, and onlookers parted around him as if he were a stone in a rushing stream. The temporary guardian he was staying with, Mr. Harlow, a stoic older man who had a gentleness in his voice, sat beside him. "You okay?" Mr. Harlow asked. Zachary shrugged, not trusting himself to speak. When the trial resumed, new revelations poured out. Suspicious transactions involving Zachary's social security number, donations unaccounted for, bank accounts opened in Zachary's name. It felt surreal to Zachary. He was 14, and he'd never seen a cent of it. The details painted a damning picture of Marvin's manipulative cunning. The tension mounted to a new high when a woman was brought in for testimony, a thin figure with sad, earnest eyes. Introduced as Harriet Thompson, Zachary stopped breathing for a second. Harriet Thompson? Was she truly his birth mother? She took the stand, her voice trembling. She explained how she had been a struggling 19-year-old with no financial means and no family support. According to Harriet, Marvin approached her through an acquaintance, promising a better life for the baby, telling her that if she gave up her rights quietly, he could provide resources she never could. "I believed him," she whispered, tears sliding down her cheeks, "but I regretted it the moment I handed my child over. I tried to find him. I wrote letters and left messages with the adoption agency, but everything vanished. I never got a single reply." She looked at Zachary with aching eyes. "I never stopped looking for you," she murmured. "I just didn't know where to turn." Zachary's eyes burned. He wanted to cry, to run, to scream. Why had Marvin done it? If Harriet had wanted him, why didn't he know? The questions hammered his brain. He also thought of the times Marvin threatened him, the times he was told, "No one else will ever care about you like I do." Now he saw that for the lie it likely was. But part of him still felt heartbreak. After all, for better or worse, Marvin had been the only father he knew. Marvin's lawyer tried to undermine Harriet's testimony, claiming she was an opportunist. But Harriet, though trembling, spoke with sincerity that rang true to everyone in the courtroom. When she stepped down, she cast a hopeful, heartbroken glance at Zachary. He stared back, uncertain how to feel. He'd fantasized about his mother in abstract ways, but never expected to meet her in the middle of his father's criminal trial. Under the weight of all this, the trial took several dramatic turns. Marvin's legal team insisted Harriet had abandoned Zachary, and that Marvin merely stepped in where Harriet had failed. The prosecution countered by detailing how Marvin cunningly manipulated Harriet's circumstances, forging or illegally bypassing required adoption protocols and then using Zachary's identity in shady financial operations. The tension soared with each new piece of evidence. Eventually, the judge announced she would rule on the financial misconduct separately. But guardianship was a pressing concern. Zachary was no longer safe under Marvin's roof. Everyone could see that. The question was, should Harriet Thompson be granted custody of her own child after all these years, or should Zachary remain with a foster or guardianship arrangement while the dust settled? Zachary felt dizzy. He was just a teenager. No one had asked him how he felt about Harriet, not really. They just expected him to pick sides. He found a momentary escape at a small coffee kiosk near the courthouse, where Miss Griffith, who had come to support him, offered him a warm tea. He clutched it in trembling hands. Miss Griffith touched his shoulder, saying quietly, "Listen to yourself, Zachary. What do you want? You have a right to be heard." He wanted safety, a home where he didn't flinch every time the front door opened. He wanted to know Harriet, but he also felt anger that she'd let him slip away so easily, even if it wasn't entirely her fault. How could he reconcile all these tangled emotions? At the back of his mind, he remembered a proverb Miss Griffith once quoted, "Sometimes you need to break before you can truly mend." Maybe that was what was happening. His life was breaking so something better could emerge. When Harriet approached him the next day, she was heartbreakingly tentative, as though expecting him to shout or run. "Zachary," she said softly, "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness or trust right now, but I want you to know I never wanted this. Please believe me." He studied her tear-streaked cheeks, the lines of worry on her face, and felt conflicting impulses. He could lash out at her, or he could choose to show a small measure of grace. Finally, he whispered, "I'm not sure what to believe, but I want to know more. About you. About me." She smiled through tears, nodding. "We can start slow," she said, "whatever pace you need." For the first time in his life, he glimpsed the possibility of genuine maternal warmth. But that possibility coexisted with pain and mistrust. Nonetheless, he felt a spark of something like hope. The days dragged by with witness testimonies about Marvin's alleged crimes. Zachary had to remain in Mr. Harlow's care for safety reasons. Harriet lingered on the periphery, waiting for the judge to decide if she could see Zachary outside the courthouse. Each day, legal drama escalated until it reached the inevitable crescendo. The prosecution submitted a request that Zachary be officially placed with Harriet during the trial, claiming she was the rightful biological mother. Marvin's lawyer opposed fiercely, painting Harriet as irresponsible. But then, unexpectedly, Marvin rose to speak. It was near the end of another tense hearing. Marvin stood in front of the microphone, shoulders taut. His usual veneer of calm had cracked. He took a moment to look at Zachary. "He's mine," he said softly. "I raised him, I fed him, I sacrificed everything for him." The judge's expression remained neutral. "Mr. Reed," then, letting out a shaky breath, he said, "I suppose if Harriet is determined to take over, I can't stop her. But this is my son. Don't ever forget that. I did what I believed I had to do." There was neither apology nor acceptance of wrongdoing in his voice, just a pained resignation and a flicker of desperation. Zachary looked away, tears threatening to spill, uncertain whether to feel pity or anger. At last, the judge decided on a temporary arrangement. Harriet would be given partial, supervised custody, and Zachary would stay in Mr. Harlow's home for the immediate future while the case continued. Zachary felt both relief and dread. The entire courtroom was swirling with chatter. Cameras flashed outside. Harriet let out a tearful sigh, gathering her courage to approach Zachary, but he excused himself to the hallway, feeling overwhelmed. He found a deserted corner by a tall window overlooking the parking lot. The sky outside was gray, with clouds rolling in, forecasting a storm. It matched his tumultuous heart. Suddenly, Harriet appeared beside him, cautious, her breath shaky. "I'm sorry," she said for what felt like the 100th time. "I wish I could take back the lost years." Zachary exhaled, shoulders sagging. "It's not that simple," he said. I've never known you, and I don't know if you really want me or if you just feel guilty. Everything is confusing," she swallowed. "I understand, and I also understand you've been hurt. I don't want to push you, but I'd like to try, if you'll let me." He looked into her eyes, noticing a flicker of genuine remorse, longing, and love. His stomach twisted. He gave a tight nod, not trusting himself to speak. She blinked back tears, placed a tentative hand on his arm, and in that small moment, He allowed her to stand next to him. Neither of them spoke for a long while. Within days, the trial for Marvin's embezzlement progressed. Tensions soared as the prosecution meticulously laid out evidence. More forged documents surfaced. Witnesses recounted how large sums of donated money never reached their intended charities. Marvin sat, increasingly deflated, as if he could no longer keep up the façade. And though it pained Zachary to admit it, part of him recognized that Marvin's downfall might be the only path to freedom for both father and son. Marvin needed to confront his crimes, and Zachary needed release from Marvin's dominion. Harriet started attending all the court sessions, quietly taking notes, sometimes giving Zachary an encouraging glance. Their interactions were tentative but less awkward than before. He discovered details about her life, how she'd lived in a different state, worked odd jobs, tried to track him down but had hit brick walls. It didn't erase his hurt, but it gave him a window into her struggles. The more he listened, the more sympathy he felt. She was no saint, but she wasn't a villain either. As Ms. Griffith once said, "We are all stories in progress." Meanwhile, from the safety of Mr. Harlow's house, Zachary tried to piece together a semblance of normal teenage life. He went to school, kept his head down, and occasionally got visits from Harriet for short coffee outings or walks in the local park. Ms. Griffith sometimes joined them, bridging the gap when conversation felt too heavy. Harriet would ask gently about his hobbies, and Zachary confided in a whisper that he loved writing. He showed her a few scribbles in a worn notebook. She teared up, telling him she used to write in a diary when she was younger. "Writing helps us make sense of chaos," she said softly. One day, Harriet brought Zachary an old photograph. Harriet as a teenager, pregnant and exhausted, but smiling bravely at the camera. On the back, she'd written, "I believed, even when there was so little reason to." He studied the photo, trying to see a hint of himself in her posture or expression. In the background was a cheap apartment's peeling walls. He realized how dire her situation must have been. "Life is complicated," Ms. Griffith had said. And now he understood more deeply than ever before. The trial's final stretch was grueling. Emotional testimonies, reams of evidence, and exhausted legal teams made the courthouse a pressure cooker. By the time closing arguments arrived, it was obvious to everyone that Marvin's elaborate web of lies had trapped him. As the judge prepared to deliver a verdict on the criminal charges, the hush in the courtroom was absolute. Zachary, Harriet, and Mr. Harlow sat together in one row. Marvin looked pale and resigned at the defense table. The judge's decision thundered through the room, guilty on multiple counts of charity fraud, forgery, and financial misconduct. Sentencing would occur at a later date, but it was clear Marvin faced time behind bars. A rustle of shock, then quiet acceptance, spread among the spectators. Though many in Lakebourne had admired Marvin, they now recognized a painful truth. They never really knew him at all. Meanwhile, the guardianship hearing had one last step, deciding Zachary's permanent living arrangements. Harriet spoke to the judge, tears in her eyes, explaining she wanted to care for him fully. The judge turned to Zachary, who felt everyone's gaze upon him. He swallowed hard, remembering all the moments he'd imagined reuniting with a mother who would love him unconditionally. But life wasn't a fairy tale. This was complicated, uncertain. Yet he felt Harriet had proven her sincerity. She was trying. Marvin had never really tried to understand him, only to control him. Zachary stood, voice tight, and said, "Your Honor, I'd like to try living with Harriet. I think I deserve to know my real mom, and I think she deserves a chance." Beside him, Harriet stifled a sob. The judge regarded them both quietly before nodding. "I find that arrangement in the best interest of the child. We will grant Harriet Thompson custody with periodic evaluations to ensure stability. Zachary, I wish you the best in building your future." It was done. The gavel banged, sealing the decision. Cameras flashed. The buzz of onlookers soared. But all Zachary felt was an overwhelming wave of relief, sadness, and hope. Later, as he exited the courthouse, a light drizzle fell. Harriet, uncertain but determined, held out an umbrella for both of them. They walked away from the building side by side, not quite mother and son in the traditional sense, but no longer strangers. The weeks following Marvin's conviction were a whirlwind. Harriet secured a small rental house in a neighboring district, wanting to give Zachary a fresh start away from Lakeborn's rumors. Moving boxes piled up. Harriet apologized repeatedly for not having more money or a nicer place. But Zachary found he didn't mind. The battered apartment smelled of fresh paint, and Harriet scrounged up second-hand furniture with a mixture of embarrassment and pride. Together they assembled a cheap wooden bookshelf where Zachary placed his notebooks, trying to envision a life that might be peaceful. Now that the trial was done, the local paper ran story after story about Marvin's downfall. Some neighbors who once lauded him felt betrayed and outraged. Zachary tried not to dwell on it. He did write Marvin a single letter. He wasn't sure why, except to find closure. He wrote, "I don't know if I can forgive you, but you were all I had for a long time, I guess. I hope you find a way to be honest for once." He doubted Marvin would respond. He wasn't even sure he'd mail it. For days he just let it sit on his desk. As Harriet and Zachary settled into daily life, they tiptoed around each other at first. She'd cook scrambled eggs in the morning, offer him a shy smile. He'd rummage in the fridge for juice and wonder what normal families talked about. "Did you ever like math in school?" he asked her randomly one evening. Harriet laughed, startled. "I was terrible at it," she confessed. Moments like that made them realize how little they knew about each other, but also how every small discovery could be cherished. Harriet found a job at a local bakery, leaving the house at dawn, returning in the afternoon smelling of yeast and sugar. She started saving money for a used car to improve her commute. Zachary enrolled in a new school. He missed Ms. Griffith, but he kept writing on his own, reading quotes from old poets Harriet had found online. "Though we travel the world over to find the beautiful, we must carry it with us or we find it not." He wasn't sure where it came from, but the line spoke to him. The courts required Harriet to attend a few counseling sessions with Zachary to facilitate their relationship. The first couple of sessions were awkward, both uncertain about how much to share in front of a stranger, but gradually Harriet admitted her regrets and her fears. Zachary confessed that he felt angry and unmoored. The therapist said, "Reconciliation doesn't happen overnight, and the best you can do is walk it step by step, willing to learn." Zachary also found a small group of friends at his new school, drawn to a creative writing club reminiscent of Miss Griffith's. He felt relief that Harriet didn't forbid him from joining. She encouraged it, in fact, coming to watch his end-of-semester poetry reading. As he stood in a modest school auditorium reading a poem titled Unraveling, he spotted Harriet in the last row, tears on her cheek. Afterward, she hugged him briefly, whispering, "I'm so proud of you." The words sent warmth flooding through him. He realized he had never once heard Marvin utter such a phrase. Meanwhile, the finishing touches on Marvin's legal fate fell into place. He was sentenced to several years in prison for financial crimes. In a final letter that arrived in Zachary's mailbox, Marvin simply wrote, "I did what I thought was necessary. I'm sorry it ended this way. Never forget I raised you." There was no apology for the abuse, no regret about forging documents. Zachary swallowed the lump in his throat, feeling a swirl of sorrow and anger. He still mailed the letter he'd written, though he didn't expect a response. By the time Harriet and Zachary had been living together for 3 months, the routine felt a little more comfortable. Harriet had hung a calendar on the fridge marking her shifts and Zachary's events. She bought him a decent second-hand bike for commuting to school. They shared more small conversations, learning about each other's preferences. He loved spicy food, she hated it. She adored morning jogs, he preferred to ride at dawn. There were hiccups, of course. Sometimes Harriet seemed unsure how to enforce rules or discipline, worried she'd push him away. Sometimes Zachary got frustrated with her anxious hovering. But they kept talking through it. One evening after dinner, Harriet mustered the courage to show Zachary a box of old photos, some from when she was pregnant. They sat on the living room floor, flipping through them, laughing at her questionable fashion choices of the time. She pointed at one photo of her standing with a stoop-shouldered older man. "That was my father," she said softly. "He died before you were born. If he had known about you, he might have helped me. Maybe I wouldn't have had to give you up." She pressed her lips together. "But I was so alone." Zachary reached out to rest a hand on hers. The words escaped him. Sometimes just the gesture said enough. She gazed at him, tears in her eyes, and whispered, "Thank you for giving me a chance." He nodded, blinking back his own tears. "I'm trying." As winter approached, Harriet overcame her shyness to attend a local parent-teacher event for Zachary. She met his teachers, listened to them praise his writing skills. On the drive home through softly falling snow, she said, "I used to love writing poems, you know. Maybe one day we can share some lines." Zachary couldn't help a small grin. Maybe that day would come sooner than either of them expected. A few days later, a letter arrived from Marvin again. This time he wrote more than a few sentences. He sounded resentful, but also bewildered, complaining about life in prison, insinuating that Harriet was still unfit to parent. He ended with, "Remember, you're still a reed." Zachary read the letter alone in his room, hands shaking. He felt pity for the man who had stolen so much from him, but also anger at his refusal to accept responsibility. Summoning a burst of courage, Zachary penned a reply. "I'm not a reed, I'm just Zachary, and I'm figuring out my life on my own terms. Good luck." He never mailed that reply. He kept it in his notebook as a form of closure, a final statement of independence. Time inched forward. The official hearing to finalize Harriet's full custody approached. Zachary was no longer a child, exactly turning 15 soon, but certainly not an adult. Harriet often seemed worried that the judge might reverse the custody arrangement, but the day came, and the judge, satisfied that Harriet had established a stable home, granted her permanent custody of Zachary. Harriet broke down in relieved tears. Zachary felt a warm glow in his chest. Though it was a quiet hearing, with no crowds or cameras, it felt as significant as any moment in his life.
That night, to celebrate, Harriet made a simple dinner, pasta with homemade sauce. They sat across from each other at the worn kitchen table, occasionally catching each other's eyes and smiling with shy wonder. After dinner, they decided to watch an old movie. Halfway through, Harriet turned to him. "Zachary, do you ever think about writing a book about all you've been through?" she asked quietly. He hesitated, swirling thoughts in his mind. "Sometimes. But I'm not sure I'm ready. It's a lot to process." She nodded, eyes sympathetic. "I understand. Maybe one day." In the following months, life found a gentler rhythm. Harriet learned to navigate the complexities of parenting a teenager who had suffered trauma. She arranged therapy sessions for him. Sometimes he resisted going, but she gently persisted. Zachary wrestled with nightmares about Marvin, with pangs of uncertainty about trusting Harriet. But bit by bit, he felt the heavy yoke of fear lift from his shoulders. He laughed with new friends, shared music recommendations with Harriet, even taught her some writing exercises he'd learned from Ms. Griffith. Harriet grew more confident in her maternal role, scolding him gently if he neglected chores, encouraging him when he needed moral support, hugging him awkwardly but earnestly when he was sad. One crisp spring evening, after Harriet got home from the bakery, Zachary greeted her with a short poem he'd composed dedicated to her. She read it, tears streaming, and wrapped him in a tight hug. "Thank you," she whispered. "You don't know how much this means to me." He smiled, hugging back, thinking that he was starting to get an inkling of how it felt to be supported, truly supported, without fear of retribution. In that moment, he thought of a quote an older neighbor used to say, "Darkness might linger long, but morning always comes." He realized how apt it felt. Even after all the darkness with Marvin, a morning of sorts had finally arrived. Summer arrived, and with it came the sentencing hearing for Marvin. Harriet asked Zachary if he wanted to attend, giving him the choice. At first, he said no. He wasn't sure if he could face that final confrontation. But the night before, he changed his mind. Something stirred inside him, a need for closure. The next morning, they drove to the courthouse. The sentencing was swift. The judge pronounced a multi-year prison term for Marvin, plus mandatory restitution to various charities. Zachary watched from the back. After the gavel struck, Marvin turned around, scanning the small crowd. When his eyes landed on Zachary, they flickered with something like regret or bitterness. Zachary met that gaze. He felt no triumph, only a heavy sorrow. This man had raised him with fear, had manipulated him, had stolen from so many, and had deprived Zachary of a mother for years. Zachary offered a small nod, not exactly forgiveness, but an acknowledgement that they were, for the final time, crossing paths as father and son. After the hearing, Harriet placed a gentle hand on Zachary's shoulder. "You okay?" He inhaled and let the air out slowly. "Yeah," he said. I think I'm okay." They walked out into the bright morning sun, Harriet's arm around his shoulders. For a moment, he felt like a child again, safe, protected, but this time without an undercurrent of dread. He cast one last glance at the courthouse steps, where a few reporters lingered. He almost laughed at how distant it felt from the boy who had trembled on the stand. The headlines would soon fade, and Lakeborn would move on to the next story. But for Zachary, there was a quiet triumph in his heart that no headline could capture. As the weeks stretched on, Harriet and Zachary settled fully into a life that, while not perfect, was theirs to shape. He attended therapy more willingly, sometimes reading his poems about Marvin and that sense of betrayal. Harriet began saving for a better apartment, or maybe even a small house eventually, so they could start fresh. Zachary found Ms. Griffith's phone number and called her, telling her about how he was living with his biological mother, how he was writing daily. She sounded relieved, proud. "I always believed in you," Ms. Griffith said. "Remember, the darkest nights produce the brightest stars." He jotted that line in his notebook, thinking how older folks often have these wise sayings, but that sometimes they hold an unexpected truth. Months turned into a year. On the anniversary of his mother gaining custody, Harriet suggested they do something special. They packed a modest picnic lunch and visited a lake 2 hours away, just the two of them, on a bright day with cotton candy clouds drifting overhead. They spread out a blanket by the water. As Harriet set out sandwiches, Zachary gazed at the gentle waves lapping the shore. He felt a flutter of peace in his heart. Harriet soon joined him, sitting cross-legged at his side, her hair ruffled by a warm breeze. He offered a small smile and said, "Sometimes I can't believe how different life is now. It's still complicated, but..." "There's no more hiding," she nodded, reaching for his hand. "I'm glad you told your truth. I'm sorry you ever had to go through all that, but I'm so proud of who you are." They ate in companionable silence for a while. Then Harriet cleared her throat, rummaging in the picnic basket. She pulled out a slender box wrapped with plain white paper. I got you something." Surprised, he opened it. Inside lay a new fountain pen with a single word engraved on the barrel, "Brave." He ran his thumb over the letters, tears threatening to surface. "Harriet," he whispered, feeling a strange warmth spread through his chest. "Because that's what you are," she said, "brave. And I hope you'll keep writing about everything, even the painful parts." Zachary nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He thought back over the roller coaster of the past year, from the tension of living under Marvin's roof to the shock of Harriet's return, from the trial to the quiet evenings in the small apartment they now shared. Life was messy, but he had found a glimmer of stability and acceptance. He had Harriet, who showed up daily with an open heart. He had writing, a channel for his voice. He had the memory of Miss Griffith's unwavering faith in him. And he had a future he could begin to shape, bit by bit. He glanced at Harriet, who was smiling at him, tears in her eyes, and he realized just how much love there was in that moment. Love that was flawed and belated, but real. He thought of something he'd read. Healing doesn't mean the damage never existed. It means the damage no longer controls our lives. Perhaps that was the lesson for both mother and son. The scars Marvin inflicted wouldn't vanish, but they no longer had to define Zachary's every breath. He could choose a new path. At last, the evening sun danced on the lake's surface, turning it gold. Harriet and Zachary began packing up, content in their companionship. As they headed to the car, Harriet paused and said quietly, "There's a quote I heard once, something like, 'It's never too late to be what you might have been.' I feel that way now. Maybe we can't undo the past, but we can still build a better future." Zachary looked at her, heart full, and for the first time he said, "Mom, I believe that." His voice cracked, but it was steady enough. She blinked, tears slipping down her cheeks, and they embraced under the orange sky, mother and son finally beginning to find the connection they were both denied for so long. In the weeks and years that followed, Zachary did continue writing, eventually crafting poems and stories that touched on identity, belonging, and redemption. Harriet took a few community college classes on child development, determined to become the parent Zachary deserved. Sometimes they clashed, as all parents and teenagers do, but they always returned to that underlying truth. They wanted each other in their lives. Over time, Zachary visited Ms. Griffith, who told him, "Look how far you've come." And he realized that the sense of safety he felt was a testament to how a life can mend if given the chance. Yes, the memory of Marvin's betrayal lingered, and yes, the question of what if Harriet had found him sooner sometimes haunted them both. But they learned that while the past may shape you, it does not have to trap you. There were family dinners in their modest kitchen, quiet laughter over Harriet's failed attempts at complicated recipes, encouraging texts from Ms. Griffith about writing workshops, and even postcards from old classmates who had once seen Zachary as a loner. Each small act of normalcy was a tiny miracle after the chaos. Sometimes Harriet would look at Zachary and see the boy she lost, the boy she found again, and wonder if he'd ever fully trust her. Sometimes Zachary would wake from nightmares about Marvin, sweaty and trembling, Harriet's worried face peering into his room, whispering words of comfort. Healing is never instant, but each morning they woke up and tried again. And that, in the end, was enough.
One day, a scrawled letter arrived from Marvin in prison, rambling about how he was appealing his sentence, blaming everyone else for his fate. Zachary quietly fed it through the paper shredder. When Harriet gave him a questioning look, he just said, "I don't need his words anymore." She nodded, understanding that letting go of Marvin's hold was another step forward. Long after the final hearing, well into Zachary's high school years, Harriet found him hunched over his desk writing with the pen she gave him. She asked if she could read some of what he wrote, so he passed her a few typed pages. Her eyes skimmed the lines, gradually filling with tears. He had written a story about a boy who discovered that love could be found even after betrayal, that families could be formed in the aftermath of pain. She set down the pages and reached out to her son, hugging him wordlessly. He wrapped his arms around her, thinking that while their bond had once been severed, it now felt stronger than anything he'd known. In time, Harriet put a simple wooden plaque on their living room wall. Engraved with a line she found in an old poem, "The broken places let the light shine through." It became their family's quiet motto. Whenever life felt uncertain, they would glance at that plaque and remember they had already survived the worst storms and learned how to find each other on the other side. So the boy who once stood trembling in a courtroom, afraid to speak the truth, grew into someone unafraid to lift his voice. And the mother who once signed away her child out of desperation reclaimed him through courage, tears, and unwavering resolve. Their story might never be neat, and some regrets would always linger, but love, in all its messy, glorious imperfection, gave them a chance to rebuild, to blossom in sunlight they never thought they'd feel. Sometimes Harriet would quietly quote a favorite line from a book she'd read. "Hope is the thing with fetters that perches in the soul." Zachary never knew exactly who wrote it. He guessed it was an older poem Harriet found, but he liked the sound of it. He'd smile to himself and think that maybe hope really had perched in his soul all along, waiting for the day he could set it free. And so they learned that even the deepest wounds can begin to heal. They learned that truth, however painful, is what paves the way for genuine connection. They learn that though betrayal cuts deep, compassion and patience can mend those cuts into scars that no longer throb every moment. And they learn, most importantly, that the bonds of family aren't solely about blood or paperwork, but about acceptance, care, and a willingness to stand together, even when it hurts. Thus ends the tale of Zachary and Harriet, but their life goes on, day after day in a small house that's no longer shadowed by secrets or lies. They can't retrieve the lost years, nor forget the heartbreak or the trial that exposed it all. Yet, as Harriet often says, we still have today, and maybe that's enough. Because sometimes finding each other in the aftermath of chaos is more precious than never having been apart in the first place. And if there's one universal lesson to glean from their journey, it's that we're all searching for a place to belong, a place where we feel safe enough to speak our truths, to reveal our scars, to dream of a better tomorrow. When we find that place, or those people, we discover that redemption is not a grand gesture but a series of small steps. We learn to forgive, to open our hearts again, and to gather strength we never knew we had. As many in middle age like to say, quoting wise traditions, the bitter past can be a sweet teacher. And Harriet and Zachary's story shows that no matter how dark the past may be, the light ahead can still shine brilliantly if we allow it in. Valuable lessons and deeper reflections for our audience. Sometimes the path to truth is fraught with fear and risk, but carrying a lie can tear us apart from the inside. Better to face the storm of honesty than to languish in the shadows of deceit. Family is not solely defined by shared blood, but by the willingness to stand with each other, offer kindness, and strive for healing. In the cracks of our brokenness, love can take root, if given the chance. Forgiveness does not mean erasing the past or excusing wrongdoing. It means choosing to look beyond the hurt so that it no longer governs our every decision. Trauma may shape us, but it doesn't have to own us. By seeking help, speaking out, and allowing ourselves to trust, even if it feels like a daunting leap, we pave the way for renewal. Hope often appears in the smallest gestures, a kind teacher's encouragement, a long-lost mother's apology, or a heartfelt poem scrawled late at night. Like a gentle bird perched in our soul, it's there if we only allow it to sing. And finally, as many middle-aged friends often quote, "It's never too late to be what you might have been." Harriet and Zachary found each other across a chasm of years and secrets. Their scars are real, but so is the beauty of two souls determined to rewrite their story. Proof that while life may bruise us deeply, it can also hold possibilities more healing than we dared to imagine.